The biting Wyoming wind was a cruel welcome for a bride-to-be. Sarah, clutching a worn photograph of a man she'd never met, believed she was journeying towards a new life, a warm hearth. She hadn't bargained on the blizzard of the century, a relentless white fury that would seal the treacherous Ute Pass, turning her dreams into a frozen nightmare. Stranded alone and facing certain death, her only hope would come in the most unexpected form, a Comanche warrior, his eyes as wild as the storm itself. Could two souls from warring worlds trust each other when the elements themselves declared war? The year is 1878. Sarah McKinley, a woman of 24 years. Though she felt a lifetime older, stared out the grimy window of the westward-bound stagecoach. The relentless jolting over rutted tracks had long since ceased to bother her. A dull ache in her bones had become a constant companion, much like the faded photograph she clutched in her gloved hand. It was a likeness of Mr. Jedediah Bailey, a rancher from a place called Freedom Point, nestled somewhere in the vast, untamed Wyoming territory. His face, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind, was stern, yet his eyes, even in the primitive photograph, held a hint of something she desperately hoped was kindness. Sarah wasn't a woman given to fanciful notions. Life in the crowded, grimy tenements of Boston stitching collars until her fingers bled to support her ailing mother and younger siblings had wrung most of the romance from her soul. Jedediah Bailey's advertisement in the Matrimonial Chronicle had been less a promise of love and more a beacon of grim pragmatism. Homesteading man of sober habits seeks a practical wife for partnership in building a life. Must be hard-working and of good character. No delicate flowers need apply. Sarah, who had shouldered burdens since she was old enough to carry a pail of water, was anything but a delicate flower. Her mother's death 6 months prior had been the final brutal severance from the only life she'd known. With her siblings scattered to various winds, one to an apprenticeship, the other to a grim factory job, Sarah was adrift. The small sum she'd inherited, barely enough for a one-way ticket to the edge of civilization, was now almost entirely depleted. Jedediah Bailey, with his offer of a home, however rudimentary, and a shared future, however uncertain, was her last resort. He had paid her passage a gesture that bound her to him with invisible yet powerful chains of obligation. The other passengers in the coach were a motley crew. A grizzled prospector whose cough sounded like rocks tumbling in a dry creek bed, a nervous-looking preacher clutching a Bible, his lips moving in silent prayer, and a woman of flamboyant dress and even more flamboyant tales who claimed to be an actress on her way to entertain the miners in Deadwood. Sarah, with her plain grey dress and quiet demeanor, attracted little attention for which she was grateful. Her thoughts were a maelstrom of hope and trepidation. What kind of man was Jedediah Bailey, truly? His letters, penned in a surprisingly neat hand, were brief and to the point, mostly detailing the practicalities of her journey and the necessities she should bring. He spoke of his land, his small herd of cattle, and the cabin he had built with his own hands. He never mentioned loneliness, though Sarah sensed it in the spaces between his words, in the very act of seeking a wife through a newspaper advertisement. She traced the outline of his face on the photograph. He was not a handsome man, not in the conventional sense. His nose was a little crooked, his jawline stark. But there was a strength there, a resilience she recognized for it, mirrored her own. She had to believe in that strength. She had to believe that this gamble, this desperate leap into the unknown, would lead to something better than the slow, suffocating decay of her former life. The landscape outside was gradually transforming. The rolling farmlands of the east had given way to vast open plains, then to rugged hills that hinted at the formidable mountains ahead. The air grew colder, sharper. The coach driver, a man named Silas, whose face was a road map of wrinkles and tobacco stains, had begun to mutter about the changing weather. "Sky's got a mean look to it," he'd grumbled at their last stop, a ramshackle trading post where Sarah had spent her last few coins on a stale biscuit and a cup of watery coffee. Wouldn't want to get caught in Ute Pass if she decides to let loose. Ute Pass. The name sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, a premonition as cold as the wind that now whistled through the ill-fitting coach windows. It was, Silas had explained, the final treacherous gateway to the region where Freedom Point lay. Narrow, winding, and unforgiving. Even in good weather, it was a place where fortunes were lost and lives often forfeited. As the days wore on, the terrain grew increasingly hostile. Towering peaks, their summits already dusted with early snow, loomed like ancient, indifferent gods. The stagecoach, dwarfed by the immensity of the wilderness, crawled onward. The prospector's cough worsened, and even the actress's boisterous laughter seemed to lose its edge, replaced by an anxious silence. Sarah, too, felt the oppressive weight of the wilderness, the chilling indifference of nature to her small human hopes. Her meager belongings consisted of a single battered trunk containing a few practical dresses, her mother's worn Bible, a set of sewing needles, and a small, treasured tin of Earl Grey tea. A final indulgence from a life left behind. She had imagined arriving in Freedom Point, meeting Jedediah, the awkward first handshake, the inspection of her new home. She had rehearsed polite phrases, practical questions. She had not, however, prepared for the raw, untamed fury that was now gathering on the horizon. The sky, once a pale, washed-out blue, was now a bruised purple, heavy with unshed snow. The wind picked up, howling like a banshee rocking the coach with violent gusts. Silas, his face grim, urged the horses on his whip, cracking sharply in the frigid air. "Almost to the relay station at the foot of the pass," he yelled over the wind. "We'll see if we can wait it out there. But I don't like the looks of this, not one bit." Sarah pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath misting the pain. The world outside was a blur of grey and white. Fear, cold and sharp, began to pierce through her carefully constructed composure. She was a long way from Boston, a very long way from anything familiar, anything safe. And as the first snowflakes, fat and heavy, began to fall, she couldn't shake the terrifying premonition that her journey, and perhaps her life, was about to take a detour from which there might be no return. The photograph of Jedediah Bailey felt suddenly very flimsy, a poor shield against the elemental power that was about to be unleashed. "End of the line for today, folks," Silas bellowed, his voice hoarse. "And maybe for a few days by the looks of it. Everyone inside, quickly now." The passengers stumbled out stiff and shivering into a world rapidly turning white. Sarah, clutching her small reticule, her trunk thankfully still strapped to the coach, felt the icy sting of the snow on her cheeks. The air was thick with it, a swirling vortex that blotted out the landscape beyond a few dozen yards. The warmth emanating from the cabin, however, was a powerful lure. Inside the main room was cramped, dimly lit by a few flickering oil lamps and the roaring fire in a large stone hearth. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, stale beer, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely like stew. A handful of rough-looking men, trappers or miners, Sarah guessed by their weathered faces and heavy garments, were huddled around the fire, nursing mugs of steaming liquid. A burly, bearded man, with a perpetually sour expression, who introduced himself as Henderson, the station master, grunted a welcome that sounded more like a complaint. "Reckon you'll be holed up here for a spell," Henderson said, eyeing the newcomers with a calculating gaze. "That there's a real norther blowing in. Ute Pass will be choked tighter'n a tick 'fore morning." The actress, whose name was Delphine, managed a theatrical shiver. "Oh, how dreadful! And I have an engagement in Deadwood." "The public awaits." Henderson merely spat a stream of tobacco juice towards the hearth. "Public'll have to wait, ma'am. Ain't no one getting through that pass till this blows over. And that could be days. Weeks, even if it's a bad one." The prospector coughed rackingly, collapsing onto a rough-hewn bench. The preacher began to murmur verses about floods and tribulations, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and religious fervor. Sarah found a small space near the edge of the room, away from the main group, and tried to gather her thoughts. Days, weeks. Her meager funds wouldn't last that long, not paying for lodging and food at Henderson's inflated prices, which he was already beginning to outline with a grim sort of satisfaction. She thought of Jedediah Bailey. Would he worry? Would he even know where she was? Freedom Point was still a good day's journey beyond the pass, assuming the pass was clear. He would expect her surely. He had paid her passage. The thought of failing to arrive, of becoming a burden instead of a partner, filled her with a quiet dread. As dusk bled into a premature, snow-choked night, the storm intensified. The wind howled around the cabin like a hungry wolf, rattling the ill-fitting shutters and sending drafts of icy air snaking across the floor. The snow fell relentlessly, a thick, suffocating blanket. From time to time, Henderson would open the door a crack to peer outside, each time returning with a grimmer expression. "Worst I seen in 10 years, he declared, after one such inspection, shaking his head. "Whole world's disappearing out there." Dinner was a watery, unappetizing stew, served in chipped enamel bowls. Sarah ate sparingly, her appetite lost to anxiety. The other stagecoach passengers were subdued their earlier bravado, or in the preacher's case, piety giving way to a shared unease. The trappers and miners, however, seemed to take the storm in stride, swapping stories of past blizzards and near-death experiences with a certain grim relish. Their talk was peppered with names and places Sarah didn't recognize, tales of survival against impossible odds, and equally tales of those who hadn't made it. One name, however, caught her attention, spoken in hushed, almost superstitious tones: Nakona. "Heard Nakona and his band are wintering up high this year," one of the trappers, a wiry man with a missing front tooth, said. "If this snow keeps up, they'll be locked in, tighter than we are." "Nakona," another man grunted. "Comanche devil. Hope he stays locked in. Don't want no truck with him or his kind, especially when a man's snowbound." Comanche. The word itself was a whisper of danger, of a world utterly alien and hostile to her own. Sarah had read lurid newspaper accounts of Indian raids of savagery and bloodshed. The Comanche in particular were portrayed as fierce, implacable warriors. The thought that such people might be nearby, perhaps even trapped by the same storm, added another layer to her fear. Later that evening, as Sarah tried to find a relatively draft-free corner to rest, she overheard Henderson talking to Silas in low tones. "Lost 2 horses already just trying to get 'em to the stable from the coach," Silas was saying, his voice weary. "This ain't no ordinary storm, Henderson. This is a killer." "Tell me something I don't know," Henderson grumbled. "Got enough provisions for a week, maybe 2 if we ration. After that—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the smoky air. Sarah closed her eyes, but sleep was impossible. The wind shrieked, the cabin groaned under the weight of the snow, and the snores of the other occupants provided a discordant symphony. Her mind raced. What if they were trapped for weeks? What if the food ran out? What about Jedediah? The image of his stern, hopeful face in the photograph seemed to mock her. She had promised to be a practical, hard-working wife, not a damsel in distress. A burden before she even arrived. A sudden violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and for a moment the main door creaked open, letting in a swirling vortex of snow and an unnatural piercing cold. Before Henderson could struggle to his feet to bolt it, Sarah saw something, or rather, sensed something, in that brief, chaotic moment. A shadow perhaps against the blinding white. Or was it just a trick of the storm, her overwrought imagination? The door was slammed shut and barred the moment intrusion of the storm's fury quickly sealed out. But a new, more specific fear had taken root in Sarah's heart. It wasn't just the impersonal threat of the blizzard anymore. It was the feeling of being watched, of an unseen presence out there in the howling, frozen wilderness. The trapper's mention of Nakona the Comanche echoed in her mind. Dawn, when it finally arrived, was not a gentle unveiling of light, but merely a slight lessening of the oppressive grey gloom. The snow had not abated. If anything, it seemed to fall with a renewed, silent intensity. Peering through a small, ice-crusted window, Sarah gasped. The world outside was unrecognizable. Snowdrifts, sculpted by the relentless wind, towered over the smaller outbuildings, some reaching as high as the eaves of the main cabin. The stagecoach was a shapeless white mound. It was as if the relay station had been swallowed whole by a vast white monster. A chilling quiet pervaded the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire, which Henderson was struggling to keep fed, and the occasional nervous cough. The bravado of the previous night had evaporated, replaced by a grim, shared understanding of their predicament. They were truly trapped. "Well," Henderson announced, his voice flat, after a fruitless attempt to push open the main door against the weight of the snow. "Nobody's going nowhere. Not today. Maybe not for a good long while." He gestured to their dwindling woodpile. "And we're gonna have to be smart about that fuel. Same with the food." The day crawled by, with agonizing slowness. The passengers and the handful of trappers mostly kept to themselves, a collection of anxious souls marooned in a sea of white. Sarah tried to read her Bible, but the words blurred before her eyes, her mind too preoccupied with their desperate situation. The actress Delphine had abandoned all pretense of glamour, her painted face now pale and drawn. The preacher prayed almost continuously, his voice a low, monotonous drone that frayed Sarah's already taut nerves. The meager rations at midday, a thin slice of dried meat and a hard biscuit for each person, did little to lift spirits. Sarah saved half of her biscuit, tucking it away in her reticule, a habit born of long years of scarcity. The wind continued its mournful song, a constant reminder of their isolation. Occasionally the roof would groan ominously under the accumulating weight of snow, sending fresh flurries of fear through the trapped occupants. Silas, the stagecoach driver. A man accustomed to the vagaries of prairie weather, looked increasingly worried. "Never seen the like," he muttered to Henderson, loud enough for Sarah to overhear. "It ain't just the amount of snow, it's the fierceness of it. Like the land itself wants us gone." As afternoon wore into another premature twilight, a new crisis arose. The prospector, whose cough had been worsening, began to gasp for breath, his face turning a frightening shade of blue. The preacher rushed to his side, but there was little anyone could do. They had no medicines, no doctor. Helplessly they watched as the old man's struggles grew weaker, until finally, with a last rattling sigh, he lay still. A pall fell over the cabin. Death in this frozen, isolated place felt stark and terrifyingly immediate. Henderson and Silas, their faces grim, carried the old man's body to a small, cold storage shed attached to the back of the cabin, a temporary morgue until the snows cleared enough for a proper burial, if that day ever came. Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was a practical woman, not given to hysterics, but the sight of the old prospector's lifeless form, coupled with the unrelenting storm, chipped away at her resolve. She clutched the photograph of Jedediah Bailey, her lifeline to a future that seemed to be receding with every falling snowflake. It was then, as the last vestiges of daylight faded and the oil lamps cast long dancing shadows, that the incident from the previous night replayed itself, but with undeniable clarity. A scraping sound at the main door, distinct from the howl of the wind. Henderson, who had been trying to reinforce the door frame with a piece of splintered wood, froze. Everyone fell silent, listening. The scraping came again, more insistent this time, followed by a muffled thud. "What in tarnation?" Henderson muttered, grabbing a heavy iron poker from beside the hearth. Silas moved to stand beside him, brandishing a skinning knife he always carried. The other men in the cabin tensed their eyes fixed on the door. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Was it the wind playing tricks? Or was it something else? The trapper's talk of the Comanche of Nakona flashed through her mind. Then a section of the door, weakened by the storm, and perhaps by whatever was outside, splintered inwards with a sharp crack. A blast of icy wind and swirling snow billowed into the room, extinguishing 2 of the lamps and plunging half the cabin into deeper shadow. Through the breach, a figure began to force its way in. Not a beast, as Sarah had half expected, but a man. He was tall, powerfully built, his form silhouetted against the raging whiteness outside. He was cloaked in furs and animal hides. His face, when he finally pushed through the splintered opening, was harsh, weather-beaten, and framed by long, dark braids. His eyes, visible even in the dim light, were like chips of obsidian, sharp and unreadable. In one hand, he carried a long, stone-tipped spear. A collective gasp went through the cabin. One of the trappers cursed under his breath, "Comanche." The warrior, for that was undoubtedly what he was, straightened to his full height, snow cascading from his shoulders. He surveyed the room and its occupants with a slow, deliberate gaze that missed nothing. His expression was stoic, unreadable, yet there was an undeniable aura of authority and contained about him. He was not seeking shelter in the manner of a supplicant. He had entered as if by right. Henderson, despite his earlier bluster, seemed momentarily stunned into silence. The iron poker in his hand trembled slightly. "What do you want?" Silas finally managed his voice tight. The Comanche warrior did not speak. His gaze swept over Silas, then Henderson, then lingered for a moment on Sarah. It was not a leering gaze, but it was intense appraising, and it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He seemed to be looking right through her, seeing the fear she was desperately trying to hide. He took a step further into the room, his movements fluid and economical, despite his bulk and heavy clothing. He carried with him the scent of the storm of pine and of wood smoke, but a different, wilder smoke than that which came from Henderson's hearth. This is private property," Henderson stammered, finally finding his voice, though it lacked conviction. "You can't just barge in here." The warrior's lips, thin and hard, curled into something that might have been a sneer or perhaps just a grimace against the cold that still clung to him. He made a gesture with his free hand, a sweep towards the storm-lashed world outside, then towards the occupants of the cabin. The meaning was clear. Even without words, the storm made equals of them all, and old rules of property and trespass meant little in the face of such elemental fury. Then he spoke. His voice, when it came, was deep, guttural, the words alien to Sarah's ears. He spoke only a few phrases, his obsidian eyes fixed on Henderson. One of the trappers, the one with the missing tooth, shifted uneasily. He says the White Death consumes the land. The trapper translated his voice, hushed. He says, his people are trapped in the high canyons. They need passage. He seeks a way through the pass when the storm breaks. Ute Pass, the name again. The frozen gateway to Sarah's hopes, and now it seemed the focus of this warrior's desperate need. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Henderson looked from the Comanche to the frightened faces of his guests. The presence of this warrior, a living embodiment of the wilderness they so feared, had irrevocably altered the dynamics of their confinement. He was not just an intruder. He was a potential threat, a wild card in an already desperate game. Sarah watched him, a strange mixture of fear and an unwilling, almost imperceptible flicker of something else. Respect, curiosity. He was like the storm itself, powerful, untamed, and utterly indifferent to their civilized notions. And yet he, too, was a victim of the blizzard, seeking like them a way out. The warrior then did something unexpected. He slowly lowered his spear, resting its butt on the floor, though his hand never left the shaft. He looked directly at Henderson, then pointed a fur-gloved finger towards the dwindling woodpile, then towards the meager remnants of their last meal. His meaning was again unmistakable. Resources were scarce. Cooperation or conflict lay ahead. The arrival of the Comanche warrior, who remained unnamed for the first few hours, shattered the fragile monotony of their confinement. Henderson, after a tense, unspoken standoff, reluctantly gestured for the warrior to move closer to the fire. It was a pragmatic decision. Letting him freeze to death just outside their splintered door would achieve nothing, and a hostile, desperate man was more dangerous than one who perceived a sliver of potential cooperation. The warrior, who they would later learn from the translating trapper, was named Tokori, meaning he who walks silently in his tongue, though the trapper simply called him Comanche as a general term. Moved with a quiet dignity that was disconcerting, he accepted the grudging invitation to the fireside, settling himself not on a bench, but on the hard-packed earth floor, his back straight, his spear always within reach. He exuded an aura of self-containment, of a man utterly at home in his own skin, even in these alien surroundings. The other occupants of the cabin watched him with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Delphine, the actress, huddled further into her furs, casting frightened glances his way. The preacher intensified his prayers, muttering about heathens and divine tests. The trappers, while wary, seemed to possess a grudging respect for his resilience. They understood better than the others what it took to survive in this unforgiving land. Sarah found herself observing Tokori with a strange intensity. He was, by the standards of her Boston society, a savage. His deerskin clothes were roughly stitched, his hair long and unkempt by her sensibilities, adorned with a single feather. Yet there was an undeniable nobility in his bearing, a raw, untamed power that was both frightening and, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, compelling. He was a part of the wildness that surrounded them, yet he was fighting it too, just as they were. Food became an immediate point of contention. When Henderson doled out the evening's meager rations, another sliver of dried meat and a biscuit, Tokori watched with an unblinking gaze. He accepted his portion without comment, eating slowly, methodically, wasting nothing. Sarah, remembering her saved half-biscuit, felt a pang of guilt for her earlier caution, though she knew it was a necessary instinct. Later, as the storm continued its relentless assault, Tokori rose. He went to the splintered door and, with surprising dexterity for such a large man, began to assess the damage. He then gestured to Henderson and then to some loose timbers stacked in a corner of the cabin, remnants of some forgotten repair. Using a combination of signs and a few guttural words that the toothless trapper, whose name was Jeb, struggled to interpret, Tokori indicated that the door needed to be better secured if they were to keep out the worst of the wind and drifting snow. Henderson, initially reluctant to accept help, let alone instruction from the Comanche, eventually saw the logic. The wind was indeed prying at the weakened planks, and the cabin was growing colder. Together, in a strained, almost silent partnership, Henderson, Silas, and Tokori worked to reinforce the door. Tokori's movements were efficient, his strength considerable. He knew how to use his hands, how to work with the available materials in a way that spoke of a lifetime of practical survival. Sarah watched, fascinated. He used his knife, a formidable blade she hadn't noticed, tucked into his belt to trim and shape the wood, his actions precise and economical. The small act of shared labor, born of necessity, did little to dispel the underlying tension, but it did create a tiny fissure in the wall of suspicion. They were still wary from different worlds, but for a brief period they had a common enemy, the storm. As the night deepened, the cold became more intense. The dwindling woodpile was a constant unspoken worry. Tokori, noticing this, made another series of gestures pointing outside, then miming the act of chopping wood. Jeb translated, "He says there's a stand of deadfall pine not far sheltered by a rock outcrop. He can get wood, but he needs an axe." Henderson hesitated. Giving an axe to a Comanche warrior felt like a monumental risk, but the fire was already burning lower, and the prospect of freezing was a more immediate threat. After a long, tense moment, he nodded curtly and produced a worn but sharp axe from his storeroom. Tokori took the axe, his eyes meeting Henderson's. There was no flicker of triumph, no malice, just a stoic acceptance. Then incredibly he turned and offered his spear to Henderson butt first, a gesture of trust or a strategic move. Jeb, his eyes wide, whispered, "He's offering a trade of faith, his weapon for yours." Henderson, looking flustered, took the spear, holding it awkwardly. The atmosphere in the cabin was electric. Tokori, now armed only with his knife, and Henderson's axe, gave a single sharp nod, then turned to the reinforced door. He unbarred it, and for a moment the full fury of the blizzard raged into the room, a chaotic blast of white and sound. Then he slipped out into the maelstrom, disappearing almost instantly. The occupants of the cabin stared at the closed door, a collective breath held. Had they just sealed their doom? Would he return? Or would he vanish, leaving them to their fate? Perhaps even returning with others of his kind. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the howl of the wind and the crackle of the dying fire. Sarah found herself praying not to the preacher's god of wrath and judgment, but to a more primal, nameless force, praying for a small miracle in this desolate place. Then, just as hope was beginning to dwindle, the door creaked open again. Tokori reappeared covered in snow. His face rimed with ice, but in his arms he carried a substantial load of freshly cut pine branches. He dropped them near the hearth, then without a word went back out into the storm. He made 3 more such trips each time, returning with a precious bounty of fuel until a respectable pile of wood lay beside the fire. When he finally came in for the last time, he was visibly tired, his breathing heavy. He handed the axe back to Henderson, who, looking somewhat abashed, returned the spear. Tokori took it, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the cabin. He had proven his worth not through words, but through action. He had provided for the group, even though he was an outsider, an other. Sarah felt a profound shift within herself. Her fear of Tokori was still present, a primal wariness she couldn't entirely dismiss. But it was now mingled with a grudging admiration and something akin to gratitude. He was not the one-dimensional savage of the newspaper stories. He was a man fighting for survival just as they were, and he possessed skills and knowledge of this harsh land that they desperately lacked. Later that night, after a slightly more substantial meal of stew, fortified with some of Tokori's dried meat, which he had silently contributed to the communal pot, a fragile truce seemed to settle over the cabin. The wind still howled, the snow still fell, but the immediate threat of freezing or a hostile confrontation had receded, replaced by a shared, weary understanding. Tokori sat by the fire, tending it with an expert hand, ensuring it burned efficiently, conserving the precious fuel he had gathered. He seemed oblivious to the covert glances cast his way. Sarah, wrapped in her shawl, found her gaze drawn to him again and again. She wondered about his people, his life in the high canyons. What hardships were they enduring? What had driven him to seek help to venture into the territory of his enemies? A collective groan went through the cabin. Spring thaw was months away. Their meager provisions wouldn't last a fraction of that time. The initial relief at the storm's end quickly gave way to a deeper, more chilling despair. It was Tokori who broke the oppressive silence. He had been out for hours, scouting, moving with an almost supernatural ease through the deep snow using a pair of crude but effective snowshoes he had fashioned from branches and strips of hide. When he returned, he addressed Henderson with Jeb once again, acting as a reluctant interpreter. "He says the pass is difficult." Jeb translated his voice barely above a whisper. "But not impossible. Not for him. He says the high winds have scoured some ridges. There is a way, a hunter's trail known to his people. It is dangerous, but it is a way." A flicker of hope ignited in the cabin, quickly tempered by fear. A hunter's trail, known only to the Comanche. It sounded like a path to certain death for city-bred folk. "And what's his price?" Henderson asked, suspiciously, eyeing Tokori. "He ain't offering to guide us out of the goodness of his heart, I reckon." Tokori spoke again, his gaze steady. "He says his people are high in the mountains beyond the pass. They have some shelter, some food, but the storm was unexpected in its fury. They need to move to lower ground, or they too will perish. He needs to reach them to guide them out. He says, if we help him with provisions, what little we have to spare, and if some of us are willing to make the journey, he will show the way through the pass. He cannot take everyone. The trail is too narrow, too perilous for a large group, or for those not strong enough." The implications were stark. Some would be chosen, some left behind, and their survival would depend on trusting a man they still viewed as an enemy. A heated debate erupted. Delphine declared it was madness. The preacher spoke of trusting in Providence, not in a heathen guide. Silas, however, looked thoughtful. "I've heard tales of these Indian trails," he said slowly. "Sometimes they're the only way. If he says he can do it, he probably can. But it'll be hell, mark my words." Sarah listened, her heart pounding. This was her chance, her only chance to reach Freedom Point, to fulfill her promise to Jedediah, to escape this frozen prison. But the thought of the journey, the dangerous, narrow trail, filled her with a terrifying dread. She was not a frontierswoman. She was a seamstress from Boston. Yet, as she looked at Tokori, she saw not a savage but a man of immense capability, a man who understood this brutal land in a way none of them did. He had saved them from freezing once already. I will go, Sarah said, her voice surprisingly firm, cutting through the clamor. All eyes turned to her. Henderson looked astonished. "You missy," he scoffed. "Begging your pardon, but you don't look the type for mountain climbing with a Comanche." "I am stronger than I look," Sarah retorted, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "And I have a reason to reach the other side. I will not sit here and wait to die." Her unexpected resolve seemed to galvanize Silas. "If she's going, I'm going," he declared. "Better to die trying than freezing by inches in this damn cabin." Two of the trapper's younger men, with a thirst for adventure, or perhaps just a desperate desire to escape, also volunteered. Henderson, after much grumbling, decided he too would risk it, unwilling to be left behind if there was even a slim chance of survival. That left Delphine the preacher Jeb, who claimed his old bones weren't up to it, and one older trapper to remain at the relay station with the promise that whoever got through would send back help, if they could. The preparations were hasty and grim. They had little enough to share. Tokori took only a small portion of their remaining dried meat and biscuits, supplementing it with his own small stash of pemmican, a dense, high-energy food made of dried meat, berries, and fat. He advised them on clothing layering what little they had, ensuring their hands and feet were as protected as possible. He showed Sarah how to wrap strips of spare cloth around her worn boots for extra insulation and grip. His touch when he helped her adjust the bindings was impersonal, yet surprisingly gentle. The hunter's trail was more a rumor of a path than a clearly defined route. It began with a brutal ascent up a snow-filled gully, where each step was a lung-bursting effort. Tokori moved with a tireless, fluid grace, his snowshoes barely sinking into the crust, while the others floundered and struggled behind him, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Sarah, driven by a desperate will, forced herself to keep pace, her muscles screaming, her lungs on fire. She focused on placing her feet in Tokori's tracks, a small act of trust in his knowledge of the hidden dangers beneath the snow. Crevasses, loose rocks, treacherous ice. The Ute Pass loomed above them, a jagged, snow-plastered wall of rock. The main route, the one the stagecoach would have taken, was clearly visible in the distance, a wide, sweeping scar on the mountainside, now entirely choked with colossal drifts. Tokori led them along a series of narrow ledges, often with terrifying drops to one side, the wind whistling around them, threatening to pluck them from their precarious footholds. Sarah had never known such cold, such exhaustion, such fear. There were moments when she wanted to give up, to simply lie down in the snow and let the oblivion take her. But then she would see Tokori, ahead, his silhouette framed against the stark white, a figure of indomitable strength and purpose, and she would force herself to take another step, and then another. He rarely spoke, communicating mostly through gestures, pointing out handholds, warning of loose snow. But occasionally, when she faltered, his dark eyes would meet hers, and there was something in them, not pity, but a kind of stoic encouragement, a silent acknowledgement of her struggle and her refusal to yield. They crossed frozen streams, their surfaces like polished glass where a slip would mean disaster. They traversed steep snowfields, where the risk of avalanche was a constant unspoken dread. Tokori, with an instinct that bordered on the uncanny, seemed to sense the moods of the mountain, the subtle shifts in the snowpack, the safest way across a treacherous slope. He moved like a ghost, his senses attuned to every nuance of the frozen landscape. During one particularly grueling section, a narrow traverse across an ice-slicked rock face, Sarah's foot slipped. She cried out her gloved hands, scrabbling for purchase as she began to slide towards a sheer drop. In an instant, Tokori was there. He hadn't been immediately in front of her, but he moved with astonishing speed. His powerful hand shot out, grabbing her arm, his grip like iron. He hauled her back from the brink, his face inches from hers. For a moment, they were frozen, suspended between life and death. Her heart hammered against his chest, her breath caught in her throat. His eyes, dark and intense, held hers. There was no accusation, no reprimand, just a stark awareness of the danger they had both faced. Then just as quickly, he released her, gesturing for her to find a more secure footing. The moment passed, but it left an indelible mark on Sarah. He had saved her life without hesitation. As they climbed higher, the air thinned, the cold intensified. The sun, when it broke through the clouds, was blinding, reflecting off the endless expanse of white. Tokori taught them to smear bear grease from his own small supply mixed with soot under their eyes to prevent snow blindness. He showed them how to conserve their energy, how to breathe in the thin air, how to read the signs of impending weather changes in the clouds and the wind. A twist, subtle at first, began to weave its way into their desperate journey. One of the younger trappers, a brash, boastful man named Miller, had been increasingly resentful of Tokori's leadership. He muttered about the Comanche deliberately taking them on a harder route, perhaps leading them into a trap. His distrust was a poisonous seed, threatening the fragile cohesion of the group. "How do we know he ain't leading us to his whole tribe to be robbed and scalped?" Miller grumbled to Henderson during one brief windswept rest stop just out of Tokori's earshot, though Sarah suspected the Comanche missed little. "He got us this far, didn't he?" Henderson retorted, though his own eyes still held a measure of suspicion. "And what choice we got? Try to find our own way back down. We wouldn't last a day." But Miller's words had found fertile ground in the fear and exhaustion of the others. The unspoken bond that had begun to form between Sarah and Tokori, a bond of shared hardship and mutual reliance, felt suddenly fragile, threatened by the old prejudices and suspicions. Tokori, whether he understood the words or simply sensed the shift in atmosphere, remained impassive. His focus was solely on the mountain on the path ahead. But Sarah noticed a new watchfulness in his eyes, a subtle tension in his posture. He was aware of the descent of the renewed threat from within their own small, desperate band. The higher they climbed, the more desolate and windswept the landscape became. The hunter's trail was a figment of Tokori's knowledge, invisible to Sarah's untrained eye. It wound through narrow, snow-choked defiles, over exposed ridges, where the wind shrieked like a tormented sprit, and across vast, sloping fields of pristine white that looked beautiful but concealed unknown perils. Tokori moved with an unwavering certainty, his moccasined feet reinforced with wrappings similar to Sarah's finding purchase where it seemed impossible. Miller, the dissenting trapper, grew bolder in his complaints. His fear, Sarah realized, was manifesting as aggression. "He's slowing down," Miller hissed to Henderson one evening as they huddled in a shallow snow cave Tokori had expertly dug for them, providing meager shelter from the biting wind. "He's playing us for fools. Probably got his buddies waiting for us just over the summit." "Quiet, Miller," Silas warned, his voice raspy with fatigue. "The man's kept us alive this far. Show some respect." "Respect for a redskin," Miller sneered, but he lowered his voice, casting a wary glance at Tokori, who sat slightly apart, his back to them, seemingly staring out at the moonlit snowscape. The moon, nearly full, cast an eerie ethereal glow over the frozen world, a true hunter's moon by its stark brilliance. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Miller's venom was potent. She had seen how Tokori's eyes missed nothing. He had to be aware of the growing animosity. The next day, the trail became even more treacherous. They had to cross a narrow, natural snow bridge, spanning a deep, black crevasse. Tokori went first, testing it carefully, then beckoned them to follow one by one. It was a terrifying crossing, the snow groaning ominously under their weight, the abyss yawning below. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on Tokori, who stood on the other side, his expression unreadable, watching each of them intently. As Miller was halfway across, he stumbled. Whether it was a genuine misstep or a moment of panic amplified by his distrust, Sarah couldn't tell. He cried out, windmilling his arms. Tokori reacted instantly, lunging forward, his hand outstretched. But Miller, in his terror, seemed to recoil from Tokori's offered help. He flailed, and for a horrifying moment, it looked as if he would drag them both into the crevasse. Then, with a guttural cry, Miller twisted away, scrabbling desperately at the edge of the snow bridge. He managed to find a precarious hold, but in doing so, he dislodged a section of the fragile span. It collapsed with a sickening whoosh, plunging into the darkness. Miller was safe, barely, but the way back was now cut off. And more alarmingly, a small leather pouch, shaken loose from Miller's belt during his struggle, fell onto the remaining snow bridge close to Tokori's feet. Before anyone could react, Tokori bent and picked it up. It was a heavy pouch. As he straightened, his eyes narrowed. He didn't open it, but he hefted it, his expression growing grim. He looked directly at Miller, who was now pale and trembling, not just from his near fall, but from something else. "What is it, Comanche?" Henderson asked, his voice tight with suspicion, sensing the sudden shift in tension. Tokori didn't answer Henderson. He spoke directly to Miller in short, sharp Comanche phrases. Miller shook his head, babbling, "I don't know what you're saying, it's just some personal truck." But Tokori's eyes were like flint. He took a step towards Miller, holding out the pouch. Then with his other hand he made a gesture, a mimed motion of taking something from his own belt, something that wasn't there. He looked pointedly at his own empty sheath, where Sarah suddenly recalled his formidable hunting knife usually resided. A collective gasp went through the small group. Sarah remembered Tokori using his knife extensively to prepare their shelter, to cut wood, to prepare food. Had it been there this morning? She couldn't be sure. Tokori spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. Jeb, who had remained at the relay station, wasn't there to translate, but his meaning was becoming terrifyingly clear. He upended the pouch, and onto the snow spilled not just a few personal trinkets, but several items Sarah recognized with a sickening lurch, a distinctive silver tobacco tin that had belonged to the old prospector, who had died back at the relay station, a small, intricately carved wooden bird that Delphine had shown her, a keepsake from her actress days, and glinting wickedly in the pale light, Tokori's missing hunting knife. Betrayal, cold and sharp as the mountain air. Miller was a thief, and perhaps worse. You thieving scum!" Silas snarled, taking a step towards Miller, his face a mask of fury. "Stealing from a dead man. From us." Miller scrambled backwards, his eyes wide with panic. I didn't. It ain't what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. He had been pilfering from their meager supplies, from the belongings of the vulnerable, all while casting suspicion on the one man who was trying to save them. And he had stolen Tokori's knife, a vital tool, a weapon, a part of the warrior himself. It was an act of profound disrespect and profound stupidity. Tokori said nothing. His face was a mask of cold fury. He simply held Miller's gaze. The silence was more terrifying than any shouted accusation. The other trapper who had come with them looked disgusted and stepped away from Miller, isolating him. Henderson, his face flushed with anger, grabbed Miller by the collar. "You damn fool! After he risked his neck for us, you steal from him, from all of us!" He shook Miller violently. "What else have you got? What else have you been hiding?" The confrontation teetered on the brink of violence. The hunter's moon shone down on the small, desperate group, illuminating their raw emotions. Fury, betrayal, and a dawning, terrible understanding of the new threat in their midst. Their already perilous journey had just become infinitely more complicated. Tokori finally moved. He didn't attack Miller. Instead, he retrieved his knife from the snow, wiping it clean with a slow, deliberate motion. He then looked towards the summit of the pass, a dark, forbidding silhouette against the starry sky. He spoke not to Miller, but to the group at large. His tone was flat, devoid of the earlier stoic patience. Even without Jeb's translation, his intent was clear. He was going on. They could follow, or they could deal with the thief themselves and try to find their own way. The fragile alliance built on shared hardship, and Tokori's unexpected acts of provision had been shattered by Miller's greed and deceit. Sarah looked at Miller with contempt, then at Tokori. The warrior's trust so tentatively given had been betrayed. She felt a surge of anger towards Miller, but also a deep sense of foreboding. How could they continue now, with this poison between them? Tokori turned and began to walk. His figure receding into the snow and shadows, heading towards the final, most difficult ascent to the summit. He didn't look back. "Wait," Sarah cried out, her voice thin in the vast emptiness. "Tokori! Wait." He paused, a distant silhouette. Henderson pushed Miller roughly to the ground. "You stay here, you treacherous dog," he snarled. "We're going with him." To the other trapper and Silas, he said, "Keep an eye on him. He ain't getting another chance to endanger us." But Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. Leaving Miller behind, even if he deserved it, felt wrong and potentially dangerous. But going on with him, a proven thief and betrayer, was equally untenable. She looked at Tokori, a solitary figure against the immense, indifferent mountains. He had every right to abandon them. Yet he had paused. Was it for her? Or simply to see if any of them still had the sense to follow the only one who knew the way? The hunter's moon watched, caught and silent, as Sarah made her choice. She took a step, then another, following the warrior's lonely path. Silas and Henderson, after a brief, grim consultation, did the same, leaving the other trapper to guard a now whimpering and terrified Miller. The Ute Pass was not done with them yet. The betrayal had exposed a weakness far more dangerous than any crevasse or avalanche. And as Sarah struggled to catch up to Tokori's retreating form, she wondered if the greatest trial was not the mountain itself, but the darkness that lay within the human heart. The trust that had been so painfully built now lay in shards, and the path ahead was shrouded in more than just snow and shadow. It was shrouded in uncertainty and the bitter taste of deceit. Sarah looked one last time in the direction Tokori had gone. A glimmer of dawn, both literal and metaphorical, was touching the highest peaks. The Ute Pass had exacted a heavy toll, but it had also revealed the depths of human resilience, the ugliness of betrayal, and the astonishing capacity for sacrifice and honor in the most unexpected of places. Her journey was not over, but it had been irrevocably changed. The man she was supposed to marry, Jedediah Bailey, was still a distant hope. But the Comanche warrior, Tokori, he who walks silently, had unknowingly led her through more than just a snow-choked mountain pass. He had led her through a passage of the human spirit, and as they began their slow, painful descent, Sarah knew she would carry the mark of that journey and the memory of the warrior with her always. What did you think of Sarah's incredible journey and Tokori's sacrifice? Let me know your favorite part in the comments below. If you were moved by their story of survival and unexpected alliances, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with your friends who love gripping Wild West dramas, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the untamed frontier. Your support helps bring these stories to life